The air in the grand auditorium of the university was thick with a tension you could almost taste. It was the 8th of September 2025, a date that promised a clash of titans. On one side of the stage sat Pope Leo XIV. He hadn't arrived with thunderous ceremony, but with a quiet humility that seemed to ripple through the room, a calm presence in a sea of intellectual fervor. His posture was serene, his hands resting gently in his lap, his eyes filled with a patient wisdom that seemed to observe everything and judge nothing. On the other side sat the titans of secular thought, Professor Anne-Marie Dubois and Professor Whitaker. They were giants in their fields, celebrated for their fierce intellect and unapologetic atheism. As they adjusted their microphones, Whitaker leaned toward Dubois, his voice a low, condescending whisper, just loud enough for the front rows to catch. "Look at him," he murmured, a smirk playing on his lips. "He brings ancient robes to a battle of minds. This will be easier than we thought." Dubois simply nodded, her sharp eyes fixed on the Pope, viewing him not as a guest, but as a relic, a living fossil she was about to dissect for a global audience. Their goal was clear, not to debate but to dismantle. They were here to corner the leader of the faithful, to ridicule his beliefs on the world stage of empirical science and prove, once and for all, that faith had no place in the modern world. The debate began, and it was a storm. The professors unleashed a torrent of complex arguments, weaving through quantum physics, evolutionary biology, and intricate philosophical paradoxes. They spoke in a language designed to exclude, to intimidate. Their words were arrows, aimed to portray the Pope as an anachronism, a gentle but misguided shepherd, lost in the unforgiving wilderness of reason. They wanted the world to see him as a relic of a bygone era, a man whose convictions could not possibly stand against the hard, cold light of scientific fact. But before we dive in, tell me where you're watching us from, and may God bless you wherever you are. Now let's begin. Professor Whitaker, sensing they had established their intellectual dominance, decided it was time to guide the debate toward the kill. He leaned into his microphone, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Let us move away from the abstract, Your Holiness, and into the realm of pure truth. Let us speak of mathematics." A murmur went through the crowd. This was an unexpected turn. Whitaker continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mathematics is the only universal language. It is the purest form of reason, untouched by superstition, untainted by faith. Its truths are absolute and require no belief, only understanding." He gestured to his colleague, Professor Dubois, who had been waiting for this moment. This was the ambush they had planned all along. And Marie Dubois stood, a faint triumphant smile on her face. "Indeed," she said, her voice cutting through the auditorium. "To illustrate the power of pure reason, I would like to present a small puzzle, a challenge not of faith, but of intellect." Behind her, a massive digital screen flickered to life. It was filled with a dizzying array of symbols and equations, a complex, non-linear differential equation that snaked across the screen like an unsolvable serpent. This wasn't just any problem. It was a notoriously difficult one, a mathematical beast that had stumped some of the greatest minds in the world for years. It was known in academic circles as the Weaver's Knot, a problem so tangled it was considered beautiful in its impossibility. The professors knew this. They knew that no one in that room could solve it, let alone someone they considered an outsider to their world. Dubois turned her gaze to Pope Leo XIV, her expression a perfect mask of polite intellectual curiosity, but her eyes held a glint of steel. The trap was set. "Your Holiness," she began, her tone deliberately gentle, almost paternalistic. "We wouldn't ask you to solve it, of course. That would be unfair." A few snickers echoed from the front rows. "But perhaps," she continued, savoring the moment, "you could share your thoughts on its complexity, its elegance. Surely even faith can appreciate the beauty of a truth it cannot comprehend." The insult was as sharp as it was subtle. It was a perfectly crafted move, designed to expose the Pope as intellectually out of his depth, forcing him to admit defeat in a language he supposedly couldn't speak. They hadn't just asked a question. They had built a public stage for his humiliation. A wave of uncomfortable silence swept through the auditorium. Everyone knew what was happening. This wasn't a debate. It was a public execution of character. Students exchanged sympathetic glances, and even some of the faculty members shifted in their seats, a clear distaste for the professor's venomous politeness. The trap had been laid bare for all to see. Dubois and Whitaker leaned back in their chairs, a predatory stillness about them. They exchanged a brief, triumphant look, certain they had cornered him. They waited for him to stammer, to deflect with a vague, pious platitude, to admit that this world of numbers and logic was beyond his grasp. But the Pope did not falter. He did not look away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the labyrinth of symbols on the screen, not with fear, but with a look of deep, genuine curiosity. Then, to the utter astonishment of his opponents, a faint, wise smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of defiance, but of recognition, as if he were meeting an old, familiar friend. He picked up his microphone, and the silence in the room became absolute. "It is indeed a beautiful problem," he said, his voice calm and steady, filling the auditorium. Then he paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air before continuing. "But it is more than just beautiful. It contains a subtle flaw in its initial premise. The effect of those words was like a stone dropped into a still pond." Shock rippled through the audience. In the front row, the professors laughed. It was a short, sharp burst of disbelief and derision. "A flaw?" Professor Dubois repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she stood up. "How fascinating. We have consulted with the world's leading mathematicians on this problem, and none have found such a thing." She walked toward the edge of the stage, her arrogance on full display. "Perhaps your holiness would care to enlighten us." She gestured toward the massive screen and held out a sleek digital pen. The challenge was now an open dare. The trap had been sprung. She was certain he had bluffed, and she was ready to watch him crumble. Pope Leo XIV rose from his chair, not with the defensive posture of a man cornered, but with the quiet grace of a scholar accepting an invitation. The entire auditorium held its breath. Every eye, every news camera was fixed on him as he walked slowly, deliberately, toward the giant screen that glowed with the impossible problem. He took the digital pen from Professor Dubois' outstretched hand, his fingers closing around it with a calm familiarity that was unsettling to his accusers. And then he began to write. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. The pen met the screen, and a line of elegant, flowing script appeared beside the tangled equation. His movements were not those of a man guessing, but of a master at work. He wasn't just pointing out a minor error, he was dismantling the very foundation of the problem, rewriting its core assumptions with a clarity that was breathtaking. As he wrote, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. He wasn't speaking in dense academic jargon. Instead, he explained his reasoning in simple, profound terms, using analogies that made the most complex mathematical concepts feel intuitive, almost spiritual. "You see," he said gently, circling a section of the equation, "the architects of this problem assumed a constant, but the universe rarely offers us such simple luxuries. The relationship here is not static. It breathes, it evolves." He was no longer a debater defending his faith. He was a teacher, illuminating a hidden truth. On the other side of the stage, the smug smiles had vanished from the faces of Professors Dubois and Whitaker. Their condescension was replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a wave of visible, undeniable shock. They followed his logic, their expert minds racing to keep up. They were searching for a mistake, a misstep, any flaw in his reasoning they could use to reclaim control. But they found nothing. Every line he wrote was precise. Every explanation he gave was irrefutable. The trap they had so carefully constructed was not only failing, but it was being dismantled before their very eyes by the man it was meant to capture. The power in the room had shifted. The Pope's pen moved across the screen with a steady, rhythmic grace. He was no longer just correcting the problem's flawed premise. He was charting a course directly through its heart. What had been a tangled knot of logic began to unravel under his confident strokes. He was solving it. The unsolvable problem was being solved, live, in front of 1,000 witnesses and a global media audience. His approach was nothing short of revolutionary. He wasn't relying on established textbook methods. He was innovating on the spot, weaving together principles from different fields of mathematics in a way that was breathtakingly original. He introduced a transformation, a new way of looking at the equation that made its complexities simply fall away, revealing a simple, elegant truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Whispers began to ripple through the auditorium, starting with the students and quickly spreading to the faculty members. A distinguished professor of physics in the third row, a Nobel laureate himself, leaned over to a colleague, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My God," he whispered, "that's not just brilliant. It's a work of art. No one has ever thought to approach it like that." On stage, the composure of Professors Dubois and Whitaker had completely disintegrated. Their intellectual ambush had turned into a public spectacle of their own undoing. They stood frozen, their faces pale masks of astonishment and dawning horror. Every line the Pope wrote was another nail in the coffin of their arrogance. They had brought a battle of wits to a man who thought on a level they couldn't even comprehend. He was not just their equal, he was their master. Their carefully planned humiliation was backfiring in the most spectacular way imaginable, and all they could do was watch as their intended victim calmly and methodically demonstrated his genius to the world. With a final, graceful stroke, the Pope wrote the last line of the solution. He did not underline it for emphasis or circle it in triumph. He simply completed it. He then placed the digital pen down on the lectern with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo in the profound silence. He stepped back from the screen, his work finished. The problem, once a symbol of the professor's intellectual superiority, a monument to a truth they believed they owned, now stood solved, tamed, complete. For a long moment, the only sound in the vast auditorium was the quiet hum of the projector. A stunned, breathless silence had fallen over the crowd. No one moved, no one spoke. It was a silence so deep it felt sacred, a shared moment of collective awe. The world had just witnessed the impossible, and it was taking a moment to believe its own eyes. Then, from the back of the room, a single student, a young woman in the cheap seats, stood up and began to clap. It was a hesitant sound at first, but it was real. Another joined in, then a dozen more. Within seconds, the single clap grew into a wave, a torrent, a thunderous ovation that shook the very foundations of the hall. It was not just polite applause. It was an eruption of pure, unadulterated admiration. Dubois and Whitaker remained frozen in their chairs, their faces drained of all color. Their arrogance was not just challenged, it was shattered. The humiliation they had so carefully planned for another had been turned back upon them, 100-fold. They had come to expose a fool and had instead been silenced by a genius. They were trapped in their seats, forced to listen to the roar of the crowd, celebrating their utter and public defeat. The thunder of the applause eventually subsided, replaced by a profound and expectant hush. The crowd, now on its feet, looked toward the man on the stage, not just as a pope, but as something more, something they had not expected. Pope Leo XIV did not bow. He did not smile in triumph. He simply waited with serene patience for the room to settle. When all was quiet, he raised a hand, not in a gesture of victory, but of gentle invitation. He then turned his gaze from the solved equation on the screen and looked out at the thousands of faces watching him. He was no longer speaking to his opponents. He was speaking to the world. "What you have witnessed on this screen," he began, his voice calm, yet resonating with a deep, fatherly authority, "is not a victory of one mind over another. It is not proof that one set of beliefs is superior." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It is a testament to the order, the logic, and the profound beauty embedded in our universe. A beauty that points to a truth far greater than any formula." He took a slow breath, his eyes seeming to meet every person's in the hall. "Reason and faith," he said, his voice now a gentle but powerful current, "are not enemies. They are not two opposing forces in a battle for the human soul. They are the two wings upon which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. One wing without the other leaves us circling, unbalanced, unable to soar. Only together can they lift us to see the magnificent reality that God has laid before us." His words landed not in their ears, but in their hearts. The professors had sought to create a moment of humiliation, to prove that faith was blind. Instead, the Pope had used their own weapon, pure reason, to demonstrate that true sight requires something more. He had taken their stage of ridicule and turned it into a classroom of wisdom, and in doing so, he had won a victory far greater than simply solving an equation. The debate ended not with a handshake, but with a quiet, irreversible shift in the world. As the audience slowly began to disperse, still buzzing with what they had witnessed, Professors Dubois and Whitaker slipped away from the stage. They were diminished, their intellectual fortress reduced to rubble around them. They had come seeking a conquest, a public takedown, but they left with a lesson in humility, delivered on a global stage. The story of what happened on that September day spread like wildfire. It was replayed on every news channel, discussed in every academic hall, and debated in every coffee shop. It became more than a news headline. It became the stuff of legend. The day the Pope, with a simple pen, silenced the giants of secular thought and solved the unsolvable. But the true legacy of that moment was not about the mathematics. Pope Leo XIV had not come to that stage to win an argument. He had come to reveal a deeper truth. He proved to a skeptical world that faith is not the enemy of reason, but its greatest partner. He demonstrated that true wisdom is not found in choosing a side, but in embracing the whole truth, both the seen and the unseen, the quantifiable and the divine. He showed the world that the greatest strength is not found in the arrogance of what one knows, but in the humble pursuit of a truth that is infinitely greater than oneself. They had tried to build a cage of logic to trap him, only to discover that his spirit was too vast to be contained. And in doing so, he left an enduring lesson. To underestimate any person based on prejudice, to assume their limits based on a title or a belief, is the greatest folly. For the truth, whether it is found in a sacred text or in a perfect equation, will always, in the end, reveal itself.